let us regard the three sorts of books. There's the books of ourselves, and we should be careful to fill these books of ourselves with the right deeds while we still can. To learn from ourselves, we could say. And there's the book of nature. And then there's the revealed and inspired books. Now, the only revealed book that has been preserved, I mean, sure, fragments must exist in various texts, but other stuff, but the only revealed book that we have is that to Prophet Muhammad, and I mean revealed of God. There may be other entities that have revealed books since, but, those aren't the entities that we're concerned with, because what the shayateen do, and of course what's been inspired. Now, do we say any one book of hadith is completely, no, that's not, you probably can't say that, but even a weak narration. So it's weak. Is it invalid? No, if it agrees with the Quran, it agrees with the Quran. The Quran calls us towards all sorts of sciences and all that. Now, in regards to the couple books that are more central to the message of religion, the revealed and inspired, while Prophet Muhammad was alive and not accessible because of the period of migration, Ali made sure to hear regular news of him. And we also should receive regular teachings about Prophet Muhammad. There's no compulsion in religion, right? But we can say that certain deeds are compelled. We know that this is the obligation for us. There's verses that indicate that once we find out what the Prophet taught, whether it's in the Quran or not, it becomes obligatory. There's Quran-only people. How do they explain so many of the things? How do they explain that the Quran is explained? Yeah, it's explained through the Quran, but, the prayer and the Hajj and all that other stuff is what you just show up and, it'd be chaos if there was hundreds of opinions of how to do Hajj. And I just don't mean supplications here and there, differences. Humans have a free will, but it's a limited free will. And humans are allowed to go along the path that they want to go upon. And people's tendencies differ. So there are some universals, some specifics. People are put in different situations, and we need to pay attention to that. There are certain differences of material culture. And Ali once asked Ja'ada bin Habera to deliver a sermon. And his nephew was unable to speak. So Ali ascended the sermon. He ascended the pulpit and gave the sermon. And just like the focus on the Kabbalah were, the two things in between the sets of 5, we got to be very careful of those. We got to be careful of our speech and our genitals, what choices we make with them. And there's also verses in the Quran that indicate, stuff about the issue of asceticism, is that we're very limited in the asceticism that we do. We don't fast every day. We don't do things to hurt ourselves. We don't abstain from marriage if there's a good spouse available. We don't, and so on and so forth. We don't go on retreat every single day. Some people up to the entirety of Ramadan or something like that, but then they have the rest of their life, the rest of the year. Some just try to catch the 10 days. The last 10 nights of Ramadan. And it works better if you're there for 10 or 11 days with it too, and you don't break your retreat. You leave for your needs, and but you don't even, stay out to comb your hair or something like that, much less for conversation. And Ali is said to have said about Umar, the second caliph, that he was such that he would gain in belief through events. Umar and Abu Bakr were known, even in Shia tradition, to be those who established the Sunnah law and to drive out the innovations. Now, by innovations, it sounds odd in English. They mean the changing of the religion, is the going beyond the boundaries. If you practice the principles in something new, then it's accepted. So there's no good bid'ah. Bid'ah is specifically what's gone beyond the boundaries of religion. That which is new, which is not part of it, will be thrown back and rejected. Those who merely think for themselves are going astray and are going astray to the hellfire, as the Sunni thing says, not whoever does something new. That's not part of it, as the saying in Muslim would go. So that's a lot of misunderstanding about that. You can do all sorts of new things. It just has to be upon the terms. You can't say that this is voluntary when it was required, or required when it was voluntary, or otherwise change the status of something, the lawful, making lawful the forbidden and the forbidden lawful and all that. And certain mischiefs cropped up after Umar. But what happened during the time of Uthman wasn't the fault of Uthman, it was the fault of some of those that were allowing themselves to be misguided after Muhammad was prophet. Some of these were up until towards the end troublemakers for Muhammad, and then they accepted Islam towards the end, and then they kind of worried away afterwards. Also kind of slowly. It took some time. It took a couple decades for things to get to the point where they would where people would kill their own kill those who Muhammad said were the youths of paradise. The leaders of the youths of paradise, because they were the top young Muslimin of while Muhammad was alive. Of course, 30 years later, actually, it was, 20 years later, that Hussein was killed, and Hassan, when was he? I don't remember. And nowadays we have some of the same problems as some of the Islamic features are being destroyed. The history related to Muhammad, where he prayed other than Mecca, even the walls of the buildings that could have been just preserved or left alone, they've torn down those walls because those are historic walls. Islam says to something in the Quran says, you look at the evidence of those before you, and you got these people tearing down these walls in the early masajid because people are going to take a historical visit. People might, when they're on pilgrimage, take a historical visit. It's like, isn't that good that they're actually confirming their faith by the history instead of looking only at the modern things? إن الذين كفروا لن تغني عنهم أموالهم ولا أولادهم من الله شيئا وأولئك هم وقود النار. So, if we call towards good and truth, and away from evil and ignorance, this is how we will find our success. And so many rulers ignore that. So honestly, if we have a choice, even if there's difficulties, if we find that in a politician, rather than this, you can't criticize the elite or the government, or you can't say that the government should be by, for, and of the people, or according to principles. Just talk about overhaul of the government, are dealing with the problems of society. You can't tell these people this is wrong, it's their culture, or you can't expect them to be decent because it's their culture, or but they weren't born in that culture. They chose that later in life, turn off your TV, all that, right? Some people will be spoke well of, and then they'll die before some issues appear in society, and they'll take no part. And one of the things, whether we're talking about children that die or other people, sometimes they died, to save them from being part. Well, it's good that they were saved from, being part of some of those things. And those who lived, well, they had the opportunity to do good and more good in their lives, but they didn't take that opportunity. And when we talk about hadith and stuff, one of the things that there's a lot of stuff along the way. There's a lot of evidences that people tend to ignore, right? Is that, there were manuscripts, there were witnesses. It wasn't just somebody wrote down a book of what he thought, to represent the prophet. You do find that happening with some religious traditions, is that a lot of representative stuff happens. Now, does it mean that the points being made in these books are wrong because of that? No, but, you look at it, it loses its religious authority. But whatever good was part of its influence is still part of its influence, even if the lying about its authenticity threw stuff away. And it would have been better that they just kept it as, so instead of the Magic of Solomon, it would have been, Rabbi Solomon, if they would have made that point clear. But of course, the calling up of spirits and angels and trying to boss them around. The light beings aren't going to be bossed around. And the fire beings, well, it's up to them. So, and let us remember that, some things can happen in this world. That one of the signs of the Day of Judgment is the slowing down of the day and night. And you can have a night without a day and a day without a night, and he could go to the poles and experience a touch of this. And it's important to think about what was going on when the verses came through. Almost everything in the Quran, or actually I think you can say everything to some degree, we have some information about it's being received. It was learned by Prophet Muhammad during this particular time. Now there's some things, it's like, well, was the verse revealed before this trip or after or during the trip? There's some instances like that. But we know at least the timing or whatever of the different chapters. It's not as easy to piece together as one might think, but there's what's going on is a very important thing in the Quran interpretation. And one thing we need to remember, that if we cling to mere enjoyments, we're probably going to have less of them. If we make our lives about enjoying ourselves, we're probably going to have less about it. That's the thing about Epicureanism that somewhat fails, is because the pleasure and pain aspect of regarding what choices you're going to make this obviously comes to some limits. And certain sense of fulfillment in a mastery of oneself in doing this or not doing that, it takes some of the edge off of that. And it might fill you with disappointment in dwindling pleasures, or, if a person prays or does rituals, like, well, maybe you don't notice the mental development, so that's off the question too, because isn't that one of the things also with Epicureanism is, leisurely life, where one enjoys study. You don't do rituals, you don't do devotion for the sake of merely enjoying it. And then honestly, you can enjoy it even more. You get that sensual, emotional, psychiatric high come in, and there's different types of that. And we can think of Islam as initiation. The suwar, the chapters or steps in a structure, we can think of those as initiations. And we can think of going along with what it seems were the actions of the Prophet and living them in one's own life, rather than trying to just come up with your own way left and right, like some people do. Like, I met this family, and this family even, they would try to find a way that conflicted with with what they thought the general Islamic tradition was, but sounded like it was following the Quran. And it's like, doesn't the Quran mention the way of the believers? And if you can't question them on what it says to be a believer, they want things for others that they want for themselves and all that, And we need to, of course, think of who was initially referred to. And in regards to these various types of magic that people talk about, it's like, first of all, look at what some of these so-called angels do. The angel of adultery, are you kidding me? Are you falling for this one? The angel, angel is so ambiguous in English, but the Malaika, the light beings, the Devas, the Ahuras, whichever term you're going to use for these things, they don't have free will, and they're under the command of God, so they're innocent. This talk about fallen angels, it's like, yes, that's the jinn, but you got to pay attention to which is which. So in English, it gets kind of confusing, and then people think, oh, well, if it's closer to blue, then it's a good one. And if it's closer to red, it's a bad one, or some switch it around. And it's like you can't tell that stuff. Or, oh, if it's willing to touch you, then it's a good one. If it's not, again, none of this thing. But we need to realize that our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings can be misled. So let's have a basis of belief. Let's ever turn trying to correct ourselves and bring ourselves to a position of, what are the 3 stages? First we end up as somebody who's, we're an animal soul. I mean, we're incarnate in animal bodies. The human body is an animal body. Some people take issue with that terminology, but yeah. And then you have a self-correcting soul, and then you have the soul at peace. I think I reached that, soul at peace, the contented soul. And there's no vicarious suffering, no vicarious whatever. When you encourage good, that counts. When people pray, that prayer counts according to its terms. So when the prophet prays for the believers, it doesn't at all mean that, the prophet's going to pray for us. So it doesn't, it's like, no, the prophet's going to pray that this sort of person, and that sort of thing. So if the prayer applies to you, then it counts for you. We got to be worried sometimes who the traditions that we receive come through. And we got to look at the chains if there's stuff in those people's lives that would make them a disbeliever. The disbelievers are those who are the enemies of Ali and some of the other ones. And you notice that, you see narrated in Nahjul Balaghah that you can't be an enemy to Abu Bakr or Umar or Uthman either, because Ali wasn't, and they would have been of the company, because some of the narrations indicate that it wasn't just Ali, it was some people with him. And so you don't exaggerate their status. Like some of the narrations through the tradition gained all this flattery and stuff as part of, the gathering whenever one of the rightly guided successors, whenever they were addressed, it seems like the tradition in some factions added on all this praise to the end, and that wasn't really the point. So he was the prince of the believers. That's, okay, but the rest of it, and when people relate traditions, it's important that they, work on trying to practice them themselves. And let us remember that the visiting of the graves is allowed. But that doesn't mean because, there's a narration that he visited the graveyard in the middle of Shaban, so that must be a Muslim Halloween. No, there's no evidence for that. It wasn't, he made sure to, no, don't fill in that stuff. But initially, Muhammad wanted to make sure that people had some lessons, just like the not fighting in self-defense or defense in others, that they held back for years because some things had to be addressed in the community before that. And our reaction to the situation about the dead doesn't necessarily reflect or help the situation of those who are dead. Because because people are going to have their attachments that they have to deal with when, the dead, whether they're having a good afterlife or a bad afterlife. Now, the thing, though, is that you shouldn't set forward that, things happen with your death or after your death that aren't right. So you're responsible for some of that stuff. So you should want to make clear that people don't bewail and beat themselves and all that stuff. Some people are going to be punished because of the legacy that they brought about. And let us be careful not to straight up reject all the traditions. And let us also not reject something just because it wasn't included in this collection or that collection. Certainly those who did the bigger collections had to narrow down some collections. And some of those who knew Muhammad, wasn't Abu Bakr one of those ones who he looked at, he wanted to be sure that he was a witness himself, and he was absolutely sure about the wordings and all that. So, he didn't want anything out of place, and so didn't he destroy his collection because he, was that careful. Now, there were those that were that careful that had collections, but we typically don't look at the hadith that Ali had written down, or Aisha, or Ibn Abbas, whether they wrote themselves or someone else was the writer. We typically don't look at that. We look at the tradition attributed to them passing on narrations. And we find that some things, most of them appear after a certain point, or all of them appear after a certain point, and that gets super suspicious. That for the first couple hundred years there was nothing about this and nothing about this, and most of the traditions about Ashura and Arba'in, most of them are in the past 500 years. The stories and all that sort of stuff. Now some of them could have came from before, but and there was individuals that recorded that Muawiyah ordered the preparation of agreeable traditions. And this started what resulted in the appearance of the Shia and then the appearance of the Sunni, is the exaggerations, because the rejectors exaggerated the status of some of the early individuals. I mean, it was more than just the couple individuals, but the narrations attributed to Prophet Muhammad, the rejectors are not, it's not a Shia-Sunni split, it's the exaggerators on both sides. And, this idea of, the excusing the killers and all that stuff like this is just like, so traditions were invented about that. But actually, Sunni tradition records that after Muhammad, people would do things that would get them put into the hellfire. And some of them will be people who would have known Muhammad. whether you say that's close companions or just, the status that the Sunnis tend to say is that, oh, they accepted Islam during the lifetime of Muhammad, so they were companion. Some people confuse the leadership of religion with the leadership of the state. People say, oh, well, the Saudis are in charge of Mecca and Medina, and they make some books. It's like, but how much money do they collect from pilgrims and stuff like that? Couldn't they cut back on taxes and still do that? Yes, they could. And the focus of what they're actually doing with their projects, with the money that they get, is actually mostly away from that. So the fact that they facilitate or allow the religion, but they're turning a profit from it at the same time, and they're having high-end, rich sheikhs. Now, you could say, well, they don't want people to be tempted by bribes and all that stuff, so you have to pay them a lot of money. And it's like, why isn't the practice of religion, why isn't that generally a voluntary effort? If people have their own media, they have their own media. And perhaps you could be paid for making CDs and stuff like that. But, the idea that somebody's making a living because they fulfill the obligations of their religion. But the people who invented traditions, they're the ones that they would have known. They would have known that lies against Muhammad would have been a way to hell. And those who disregard things, it's like, oh, I don't really feel like that and all that other stuff. It's like, it depends on what you're able to do, not what you feel like, what you're able to do. And if Ali spoke well of Abu Bakr, Uthman, and Umar, shouldn't he have been regarded like that? That special care would have been taken care of him and Hassan and Hussein. There's a greater increase nowadays of this idea that scholarship is unlawful, that it's just a clinging and you pass on the interpretations of others. There are those that say that it's about love, and other than that, it doesn't matter. There are those that treat music, musical instruments other than the voice, as if that's the way of worship. There are the all one people. There are those that think they are specific incarnations. There are those that think they can become united. There are the panentheists. There are those who, as the verse says, they seek to cause divisions with the meanings, or they don't, they seek out these hidden meanings. And you can look at the different layers of meaning, the esoteric, the exoteric, the ethnic, but it should be based on the knowledge. So the wahdatiya, the ittihadiya, the hulula, the wasaliya, the zaraqtiya, the ushaqiya, the talqiya. These people, of course, are in the wrong. And there is some basis of some of the practices. The watering place, you can pick a particular, you can pick a particular set of supplications to make. That can be a very good thing. But again, don't make something obligatory that's not obligatory. There's stuff that I like to say when the evening comes around, in the late afternoon, in the early afternoon, in the dawn, or, after the sunrise sometimes. Well, but anyways, after the time for Fajr comes in, the horizontal lines of twilight start. The after, did I say the after, between dusk and dawn? There are certain things that I like to say, but if I miss them, I miss them. It's good to say the couple were caught before or after, but if I miss them, I didn't do anything wrong. We need to remember that about that stuff. And we got to remember what is actually the rules about stuff, and you don't go to extremism in terms of the names. They can evoke you in certain ways, they can be a means, but it's not, poof, I've said the right thing, and therefore, we don't abandon the world, we abandon the world for the world. We use the world towards God, because we're given our worldly opportunities to employ God consciousness in it. So, not only the sanctity of places of worship and things used for worship, but we are preserving the opportunity for ourselves and others when we protect and defend the places of worship and the religious things and the worshipers. And if people overstep things and deny themselves this world, just for the sake of denying themselves or whatever, one, self-abuse, if it equals that, that's wrong in itself. You can't cut yourself and all sorts of stuff, and atone for stuff. If you need a legal punishment, you need a legal punishment, but it's not that you privately beat yourself or you abuse yourself. That's not how it works. And of course, people trying to deny themselves can produce certain wrongdoings other than that too.